So now we're at session 2 in our agenda. And what we're going to try to do right now is to kind of break down in parts, so to speak, what were some of the major findings from the Bringing Wetlands to Market project. And my role is to kind of kick off that part of our discussion. And what I'm going to try to do is to give you the project in a nutshell. Not go in depth in any particular area, but just knowing that you're going to hear a lot more about each of the components of the project as the 2 days unfold. But to make sure that everybody has this broad understanding of what the project entailed, why we started to do it, and what we were hoping to accomplish out of it. And so I'm going to do that in very broad brush strokes in the next few minutes. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to try to step through the slides pretty quickly because I know that each of our various project team members that will come after me will go in depth in each of these areas. But one of the things I wanted to just point out is that when we started this project, when we sent in the proposal to the Neuroscience Collaborative, who you've heard about before, the project was not called Bringing Wetlands to Market. It was actually a long name, you know, looking at carbon, nitrogen, greenhouse gas fluxes, cycling in wetlands, and all these different things that came after that. And we wanted to, in collaboration with our funding partner, try to find a name that was easier to say, easier to refer to, and would actually be intriguing for folks. And so, in fact, the Neuroscience Collaborative, their communications person, suggested the Bringing Wetlands to Market theme, which we wrestled with a little bit because we were like, our project has a market focus, but it's not just about the markets. And so we didn't want to necessarily have that dominate the entire project, but we did like the kind of intriguing nature of that title, Bringing Wetlands to Market, and having that kind of pack a punch in terms of having opened up people's thoughts to think about what that might mean. And could it generate some questions about what do you mean by that? And then would open up some space to have a conversation. And one of the elements of our project was really to do this in a collaborative way. And by collaboration, I'm going to get down into what we mean by collaboration as a theme in this project a little bit in depth further on. So I'm going to try to give you this Bringing Wetlands to Market project in a nutshell, talk about end users and stakeholder engagement, what we did, why we did it, and what were some of the contributions from that process piece, and then end with just some thoughts about how we can really link what we're learning and what we've learned through the project and the tools that we've produced to practice. I want to step back before jumping into what the project was about and describing it, to really step back and talk about why we did this work. Some of the points that have already been made in the 2 keynote presentations that we heard this morning have already kind of picked up on a number of different themes that are interwoven in our project, but I'll just try to summarize a few here again to kind of paint that backdrop as to 4 years ago when we got funding for doing this, wrote a proposal with our partners and had a lot of discussion about what we wanted. One of the questions we asked ourselves is, when this project ends, what do we want, what do we hope will come out of it? What do we want it to influence? And we had a lot of conversations about that. And so, paint the backdrop, why this work was important, what motivated us. The state of our coastal wetlands, understanding that they, as you heard through David's talk, perform all these important ecosystem services. Carbon storage is one of those that a lot of work was possibly going on, as Lisa Marie talked about. But when we started out, we realized that not many people, of all the different services that wetlands provide, if you were to list them, not many people could name that one as one of the benefits. And so it was under-recognized in kind of like the public side and even in coastal management world, so to speak. And then on top of that, you have these valuable ecosystems doing all these great things for us, but at the same time, they're threatened. And if you think about that globally, they're threatened by human impacts. I just spelled out nitrogen loading and sea level rise. There's a couple factors. There's critical loss and degradation going on. And so you're faced with, they provide these benefits, there are all these threats. And on the bottom, you have barriers to restoration. One of the things we did with our end user partners earlier on was to kind of did some interviews to ask them what they thought of these aspects that the Bringing Wetlands to Market project would look at: blue carbon storage, better understanding greenhouse gas dynamics in wetlands, nitrogen loading issues. And one of the things that came out of this, at least in terms of discussions with one of our partners, Restore America's Estuaries, was just that a barrier to restoration is really, why don't we have more degraded wetlands being restored faster, quicker? Is really that there's a lack of funding to drive investment in that. And that might be like, oh, we already knew that going in, but people always ask us, why do you guys have this markets component? Whenever we start talking about the markets piece, it's almost like first you get a blank stare, and then you're like, break that down for me, what does that mean? And this is where the markets piece comes in, is to address that barrier for restoration by driving financing that could be directed towards wetlands restoration and conservation. And that's all I'll say about that. I'm sure our partners from Ray will talk a lot more about that later. We heard about the value of our wetlands and the riches that they have in the soil component, the wetland carbon bank. And there is some work done by Crooks and Maury et al., a paper in which they have this graph, which I've just pulled out a section of. I'm not showing the complete graph, but it's one of the, you'll see it in some of the materials you have in your folders, the fuller graph that shows all the different types of coastal wetlands in comparison to forests. And the theme I just wanted to point out here is that this is an interesting slide because it's showing that when you look in the soil for salt marshes compared to forests, our salt marshes are doing such a great job in terms of like storing more of that carbon in the soil compared to forests. And people know the value of our forests, the role they play in storing carbon, but this under-recognized component that salt marshes actually kind of beat them to the punch in terms of storing 3 to 5 times more carbon in their sediment. So again, I'm just painting the backdrop, all the different pieces putting together why we started jumping into this Bringing Wetlands to Market work. Another theme was about addressing climate change. The NERRs in particular, where reserve, as Jim talked about, being part of the reserve system, had a big thrust on looking at climate change work, both in the mitigation aspects and in adaptation, and looking at the role the NERRs could play in this area. And being living laboratories, could we better understand the role that our coastal ecosystems are playing in this realm? And so there are 2 ways that you can think about it on the climate change side, is that you have, by energy use, there are ways that you can try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce carbon production, or you could think about ecosystem roles from forested ecosystem, wetland ecosystems, storing more carbon, or try to get both of those components going at the same time. And so our project was really zeroing in on that element over there, that bottom right-hand picture, which is showing the role that wetlands play in storing more carbon. Also, why we did this work: nitrogen loading, an important local issue for us. One of the themes that the Science Collaborative, our funding partners, really emphasize is making sure that the science that we're doing is connected and relevant locally. So that you're not just, in this case, for our funding partners, there was a real interest in just making sure that we could connect the science with management application on the ground once this project wraps up. And in the Cape Cod context, where our reserve is located, nitrogen loading is a dominant environmental issue. Communities, you're seeing here, severe algal bloom from right outside the bay, fish kill that happens as a result of eutrophication and hypoxic conditions in the water. And then you have that as a backdrop, communities trying to figure out solutions to address nitrogen loading. And for our project, how do we weave that back in with the blue carbon story? Well, there's evidence to show that nitrogen loading could potentially impact the sequestration role that wetlands play, and could also be a problem in terms of having more nitrous oxide being produced from the wetlands. So could it essentially have wetlands play a role in terms of not just being a sink for greenhouse gas like N2O, but being a source of that? And when you expand that, what that means, globally speaking, that's a pretty big deal. And so the nitrogen piece of the story came into the puzzle. So BWM in a nutshell, I'm going to spend some time on this graph. We have here 4 components. We were aiming to kind of improve understanding of carbon dynamics and biogeochemical processes in salt marshes. understanding that there was a lot of work that needed to be done to figure out what the controls were, what the budgets were, what the drivers were, and then could we use that understanding to feed into the development of tools for managers and policymakers. So on the left, we have innovative science. We're trying to really get a sense of do the best science, as Lisa Marie said, to figure out these budgets in our New England salt marshes. Look at nitrogen influence on that, and then look at habitat relationships between greenhouse gas fluxes and plant communities and soil properties. So to do that, we did a lot of field investigations and lab work. Then we were trying to feed that science into development of a user-friendly model that could give us a predictive capability. There's a lot of intensive sampling that has to go on into doing that first left-hand bar. Can we produce a way where others don't necessarily have to do that? They don't have the instrumentation or time or resources to do that. So can we do a model that could be user-friendly enough for people to be able to plug in data and be able to get an understanding of carbon storage in a wetland that they might be interested in knowing more about. And then this financing piece that I hearkened to earlier on about that barrier to restoration, needing more funding to be driven towards restoration conservation priorities. Could we find a way to ensure that wetlands could be considered in the carbon market world as a means of driving carbon financing? And one of the barriers to doing that was that there wasn't a carbon offset methodology in place to be able to make that process happen. And so Ray was already working on that, and in developing this proposal, we linked with them as a potential end user to do that. And then the economic analysis side, we left space in our project to say, we know sometimes it comes down to people understanding what does this mean in terms of value, again, on the money side of things. And so is a carbon market project worth it? And we looked at that through a local case study. And underpinning all of this was this collaboration with end users. And then for the last few minutes that I have, I'm going to go through this part very quickly, but it's a part I don't want us to miss. That under this project, we really tried to do it in a collaborative way. And many people in here are already collaborating in a variety of forms. So you might be asking yourself the question, if you weren't a part of the BWM effort, why this thrust about collaboration? And what we mean here is that the science and the collaboration with end users is happening in a way that kind of hedge box at the end, where they're interlinked throughout the whole process. So from the beginning of the proposal development, throughout the course of our project, we were aiming to do this, to see our end users as contributors and not just recipients of information. So we just didn't want to do the science on the front end and then come back at the tail end like we are now, but we wanted to keep that dialogue going and get their input. We want to provide specific and explicit opportunities for our users to help to modify and inform the approaches that we took. And we did that in a number of different ways. And then we want to facilitate interactions between our team members, who were comprised of science investigators and end users, and the broader end user community to do that learning. But the context that we started working out in is that blue carbon was an emerging issue. It was not something that we would find on audience needs assessments. It wasn't something that managers were knocking on our door asking us to do work on. And so there was limited blue carbon focus in the region, but yet a heavy focus on nitrogen loading. Within that context then, how do we do this collaborative focus? And the challenge was to make the science relevant to our users and their management priorities. So putting blue context in their work, blue carbon in the context of their work, and helping them to kind of make that link with how it could be integrated to achieve the goals they had for policy and management. But it's also a complex topic, and our project had the markets element, had a new topic on blue carbon, it had nitrogen loading, had models that people kind of shy away from if you're not a modeler. And so many complex topic, but potential for broad application to a number of different users. And so we're trying to kind of make that connection. And then we have this thing that I talked about before, the market versus the non-market. Both elements are in our project, so how do we press forward in the collaborative, in a collaborative project, kind of balancing those two? And we looked at our end user groups in kind of two categories. We sought out a set of end users to help us to be actually a part of our team, and those are the Restore America's Estuaries, FIU, our modeler, and our economist from management. And we knew that we would need kind of, from the science that we were happening and the project, we needed kind of a first tier of application. And so all these partners are producing either a tool or a resource that other, the tier 2 end users could then use. And bringing blue carbon home. I mentioned before that for us, being in Massachusetts, being on Cape Cod, we needed to make that connection, to weave this work back to them. And so we were always kind of having work being done at the national level, but also trying to bring it home to the state and at the local level as well. Stakeholder engagement, we attempted to do that in a variety of formats. We try to get people out in the field, we try to get them workshops, we try to just do a list of different things, not just to check them all off, but because there were different ways that we could engage with our stakeholders. And this is a question that we actually put to our stakeholders. How do you want us to engage with you? And so these ideas through roadshows, through one-on-one interviews, through different ways, is educational products, we try to do that. And how did we use their input? I could spend like 10 minutes on this graph explaining each one. But just to say, I will probably give you snippets of this information throughout the day as I set up each different session. And I'm pretty much out of time, so I'm going to wrap it up very soon. All of these different blocks represent something that our stakeholders, either through dialogue with them or input that they gave, helped us to kind of either do something differently, think about how we communicate about the subject, or different partners to reach out to. And I'll just, for the sake of time, focusing on that first one here, Shape the Economic Analysis Herring River case study. This is one place in our proposal where we left space. We said, this is what we intend to do broadly on the economic analysis, but we want this to really be shaped with end user input throughout. And this kind of grew out of conversations with our science team members and restoration practitioners and at the National Park Service, and that kind of bubbled up with our own team, and that economic analysis took shape as the project unfolded. So we just didn't go in and say we're going to do this and only stuck to that. It was really formative with our partners. And so coming back to the theme of bridging science, management, and policy, we're hoping that all of the science that we've done throughout the project, the tools and resources that we've been working hard on, can feed into a variety of different ways. And this is a challenge, but it was also a really good thing for the project, that each component of it could link with climate change policies and plans. It could link with this idea of a resilient coast, adaptation planning, wetlands restoration and conservation, dealing with nitrogen loading at the local level, regulations and permitting, education and outreach, had so many different layers to it that sometimes it was difficult to kind of think about how you bring this all in, how you communicate all that richness to people. But the blessing is that there are different pieces of this project that can tie in and inform decisions at all these various levels. And so a few noteworthy achievements. When we started out this work, just not much awareness about blue carbon, at least where we were working. We knew others, maybe in the scientific community there was. And we've seen just tremendous increase in awareness, these deepened relationships among scientists and end users, and our scientists that we've been engaging with, really understanding and appreciating this collaborative approach, and our end users too, not just a one-way thing. So this collaborative research thing actually does work and has a different kind of impact. New research needs being identified, and growing interest in really exploring how do we now just apply this to management and policy decision making. And so with that, being out of time, I just want to quickly thank our project team members who you're going to hear from, each of them throughout the day, all our stakeholders and end users, some of who are in the room today that we've been having conversations with, inviting you to workshops, inviting you to field trips, and then again our funders. And thank you all for today. All right, so that's it for me. BWM in a nutshell.